Welcome to the shutter speed lecture. Now, shutter, as you know, is one of the controls for exposure. It helps regulate how much light comes into your camera. It does this by time, usually in fractions of a second, 60th of a second, 500th of a second, so forth. You should all know this by now. We've already gone over basic camera exposures. But the shutter also has control over something else. It controls motion in your pictures. Now, before we get further into this, I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of the shutter. Now, interestingly, when photography was invented, way back in 1839, there were no shutters. Cameras did not need shutters. Exposures were so long that the way the time exposure was controlled was by simply taking off or putting on the lens cap. This is a very early daguerreotype, right around 1839 or so. And here we see a Parisian boulevard. Daguerre was a Frenchman and worked out of Paris. Now in this picture, you can see a lot of the hallmarks of the daguerreotype. It's very detailed, also very fragile. You can see many scratches that have accumulated on it over time. But another thing you don't see is, well, people. It's kind of a funny picture because this is in the middle of the day, bright sunny day, and yet there's no one in the picture. And this is because of the long exposure. Even in the best conditions, exposures for daguerreotypes were about 8 minutes long. Now in 8 minutes, any people that were in this picture, any people, horses and carriages, any other things going down the street, would disappear because they would move. If there was a horse at the corner of this street here, well, 8 minutes later, he's down the street and gone. So you weren't able to capture anything that was moving in early photographs. Interestingly, though, in this particular picture, there actually is a person. If you look down in the bottom left corner of the picture, and I'll show you a close-up here, a man stopped to have his shoe shined. So he stopped, and during the time for the exposure, he had to stand still long enough to have his boots polished up there. So this is actually the very first picture of a person ever recorded on a photograph. Now, as materials continue to improve, exposures got shorter and shorter. Pretty soon, by the late 1800s, exposures under the best conditions were down to less than a second. So you would think at this point, someone would say, well, it's getting really hard to take the lens cap on and off accurately with such short exposures. We should invent a way to control this, like the shutter. That's not how the invention of the shutter happened. The shutter was invented because of a bet. Basically, at this point in time, people didn't have a lot of entertainment options. There was no TV, no movies, no radio. And what people often would do for entertainment was have big dinner parties, invite people over. And then afterwards, they would throw out a topic for conversation, something to get people talking and discussing stuff. One of the topics that often came up was when a horse is galloping, does it ever have all four of its hooves off the ground at the same time? So people would debate this. Some people would say yes, as it leaps through the air into the next gate, and other people would say no, it always has a few hooves on the ground. It's a much more steady kind of motion. Thing was, you couldn't really tell. Even if you were in like a carriage next to a galloping horse watching, the movement was too fast. It happened too fast for our eyes to record. So people would debate this, but there was no way to prove it. Ex-governor of California, Stanford, had made a bet with a friend on this subject. So they tried to figure out how to prove this one way or another. Stanford approached a photographer, Edward Muybridge. Now, Muybridge, besides being a photographer, was also known as something of an inventor, a bit of a scientist. So Stanford approached Muybridge and says, can you take a picture of a horse as it's galloping? And see, so we could see if all of its hooves are off the ground at the same time. So Muybridge said, interesting problem. I'll get back to you. So Myridge started thinking on this. And one thing he realized right off the bat was that he would need to have a very short exposure, because the shorter the exposure, the better it would be at freezing the motion. So he invented the first shutter. It's a fairly crude device, basically a couple of wood slats which would cover the lens. First slat would drop out of place. Then 90th of a second later, 1/90th of a second, the second slat would drop down, covering the lens again. Then he realized he needed a bunch of photographs, because how do you know when to take the picture at the right time? Yeah. So what he did was he got several cameras, I think it was around 30 or so, and put them on a racetrack, on one side of the racetrack. Then he ran a string across from each camera, from the shutter of each camera across to the other side of the track. And what would happen was, as the horse was galloping down the track, it would hit the first string and set off the first camera. Then it would hit the second string and knock off the second camera, and so forth. So as the horse was galloping, it would, all these different cameras, as you can see in this drawing of the apparatus here, would go off at the different phases of the horse's gallop. And this was the end result of his experiments. Now, as you can see, a horse does indeed have all four of its hooves off the ground as it's galloping. Although people were very surprised, because most people thought it was going to be around the 7th or 8th exposure here, when the horse's legs were stretched out, kind of leaping into the next gait there. But as you can see, in 7, 8, 9, and 10, he always has at least one hoof on the ground. It's actually when the legs are all drawn up underneath the horse that he is flying through the air with no feet on the ground. Well, Myridge is very happy with the result. He's able to show what the gallop of a horse was like very clearly, as you can see in these pictures. And he didn't just leave it at that. Soon he started photographing all kinds of other animals. Here, this is called a camel racking. So you can see the different phases of a camel as it moves around here. Even elephants. You must have had some friends down at the local zoo. But here is an elephant, going down the track, the different phases of that. Even birds in flight. Here's a cockatiel captured as it's flying along. Now, even though he meant these pictures, more for kind of scientific study, a lot of people found these pictures really fascinating, because that's another thing about a fast shutter speed. It captures action that our eyes can't see. It's literally seeing something we cannot see. So here with this cockatiel, if we saw this cockatiel flying by, well, we could watch it fly by, but it would be happening so fast, we really wouldn't be able to see any details of the flight. Here, you can see each of these pictures, you can examine them as long as you want, and you can see really good detail of what the different phases of a bird flying is like. I always thought it was interesting, number 13, when the wings are totally spread out, how the feathers at the wingtip are almost like fingers, how they're actually kind of spread apart, or through like 16, the end of the second row and the beginning of the last row, how the wings actually kind of sweep forward a bit during the flapping motion there. He also photographed people doing various things, sometimes various rather bizarre things, as we'll see here. This is called Start of a Run. He's got this athlete model here. He's actually standing still in the first picture, and then a gun goes off and he starts off, goes blasting off to start his sprint. Now, as he continued to work with these devices here, the cameras, he continued to improve his technique. One thing he did was photograph from different positions. Besides the side, he would also shoot from the front and sometimes from behind, so you get different angles of the motion here. Here we see the same runner on the full run here. Now he's at top speed, and just like the horse, you can see how during the run he is indeed flying through the air before his foot comes down and pushes off into the next step there. Now, when he photographed people in motion, he often photographed them either nude or semi-nude. The reason for this was that he wanted to see all of the anatomy of motion, and not just where the leg or the arm was, but which muscles would tense up, which ones would relax, which tendons were showing up here. So to get a better idea of the whole physical aspect of motion here. And here is a man doing a handstand. And again, even though these are meant for scientific observation, a lot of other people found these interesting too, because again, it freezes motion. It's things we cannot see. Number 10, the man, just as he's landing the handstand there, if you take that picture out of context and just look at the photo there, it's just totally bizarre. It looked like he's doing an impossible balancing act on that one foot there, because there's no hint of motion. There's no blur. The motion is perfectly stopped by the fast shutter speed. Now in the bottom strip, which is photographed from the front, you get some bonus motion here. You see a pigeon has actually wandered onto the track here. And as the guy is doing the handstand, the pigeon gets spooked and takes off. So besides the man doing the handstand, you also have a step-by-step pigeon taking off. Here's a close-up of the last frame that he recorded here. You can see the strategic placed pigeon as he spreads his wings and flies away there. Also, the man, as he's landing his handstand there, one foot's already down. You can see how he's looking down, for the placement on the other foot. He's a little crooked in this landing here, so I'm only going to give him an 8 out of 10. Here's another single image from a series. And taken out of context, again, the pictures look very bizarre sometimes. This picture, looks like this guy is carefully holding this person and maybe laying him down there. Actually, this is 2 wrestlers. And what's going on is the one guy is throwing the other guy down. In the background, you can see that grid system and the numbers at the bottom. He would do this so he could see how much change would happen between each frame, how much motion was going on. Here, a child running. Children are still developing. They're not fully grown. Their physical strength and bones and that are still forming. So how is a child run differently than an adult? So he has a series of a child running here. And some kind of bizarre ones. This one's called Woman Turning, Blowing a Kiss, and Climbing a Stair. Woman hopping on one foot. Woman running and kicking a hat. And one of my favorites, man lifting and heaving a 75-pound boulder from 3 different angles here. Yeah. Now, while scientists really like this work because they were able to study the whole physiology, anatomy of motion, artists also really like this work. And as we'll see later, this work really affected art because this is long before abstract art. The mark of a good artist back then was how realistic you could be, how accurate you were able to portray things. And by stopping these motions here, artists could look at this and then incorporate action into their paintings and have it be much more realistic. And my all-time favorite, a 360-degree view of a woman spanking a child. So, before Dr. Spock and child abuse laws, I guess, here. But yeah, interesting. And as we'll see, Muybridge with these stop action pictures created a whole series of other kinds of photography after this.